Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for taking some time to listen to what we have to say. We're going to be talking about the environmental concerns that are much in the news, about some of the background involving them, and where they are leading our country. And we want to start off by saying that credentials behind the name of an individual are not nearly as important as the facts that he has, the ground that he stands on. And that always reminds me of the story of the ship captain, the naval captain, who was plowing along in his ship one night, and he sees some lights way out in front of him flashing, telling him to turn his ship 10 degrees to starboard. Well, the captain of this naval vessel wasn't too happy about that, so he told his man next to him, he said, "You flash back and you tell him turn his ship 10 degrees to starboard." So the man did so, but the message came right back, "No, no, no, you turn your ship 10 degrees starboard." And this time the captain of this naval vessel was quite in a huff about it, and so he said to his man, "All right, here's your message." He said, "I'm a captain aboard this United States naval vessel here at sea. You turn your ship 10 degrees starboard." And then the final message came right back and said, "I'm a seaman second class and I'm aboard a lighthouse. You turn your ship 10 degrees to starboard." Obviously, the ground you stand on is far more important than any credentials you might have, and that's certainly a good example of it. Now, we also know a story about a young fellow who went to Sunday school, and he came home having been taught the biblical story of the crossing of the Red Sea, where the Jewish people were chased by the Pharaoh's army, and when they couldn't cross the Red Sea, God parted the waters and they were saved. So his mother asked him when he got home to explain to him what he'd learned in class. And here's where he told it to her. He said, well, the Israelites got out of Egypt, but the Pharaoh and his army chased after them, and they got to the Red Sea and they couldn't cross it, and the Egyptian army was getting closer. So Moses got on his walkie-talkie. The Israeli Air Force bombed the Egyptians, and the Israeli Navy built a pontoon bridge so the people could cross the river. Well, you can imagine at that point the mother looked at him in shock, and she says, "Is that the way they taught you the story?" And he said, "Well, no," but he said, "If I told it the way they told it to me, you wouldn't believe it." Well, the boy was skeptical about something that I think he should have believed. And today we have an awful lot of our fellow citizens who are believing when they should be skeptical. And that's part of what we want to talk about tonight. What should you be skeptical about? Well, realize, of course, that a lot of what we are being told falls into the area of being politically correct. You're not supposed to take a position on this or that or some other things because it's just not done. It's not politically correct to do so. You're not, for instance, to talk about the fact that the 1992 election was between George Bush and Bill Clinton, both of whom have ties to the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. In other words, their policies may differ slightly, only slightly. Whatever is going to come out of either is certainly the same kind of internationalism and so forth that is hurting our country. Now, the first subject we want to talk about here in the environmental area is global warming and the greenhouse effect. And everybody in our country has been told about it. And the greenhouse effect, global warming, is all one phenomenon tied together. And the explanation of it is simply that the heat rises, as we know, and when the heat rises, it's being trapped by a canopy of man-made gases, especially carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and sulfuric dioxide. Some of the gases that we produce when we burn oil, coal, and natural gas, when we use our automobiles and so forth. And the theory holds that this canopy that is formed by these gases that we create is trapping heat that rises from the earth and ordinarily would go off into space, and therefore when it's trapping the heat, then more of it comes up, and then the earth is actually warming, and there are some catastrophic consequences that have been discussed about the warming of the earth, and among them would be the melting of the polar ice cap. If the polar ice caps melted, the North Pole and South Pole, there could be as much as a 6 to 8 inch rise in sea level throughout the world. Now, that might not seem like very much, but if indeed that ever did happen, it would be catastrophic. And along with that, they talk about reduced summer rains and then parched agricultural lands. And so, because the earth is warming and these catastrophic consequences face us, We're being told that we must cut down industrial activity in our country. We must cease using our automobiles to the degree that we're using them. We must even reduce the population of our country. And that, in a summary, is the global warming theory, the hypothesis. Now, what's interesting about it is that some of the very prominent people who are promoting the global warming theory today were only 15 years ago telling us that we were entering an ice age. And you say to yourself, well, why should we believe them now when obviously they were wrong then? Well, let me quote a few things here. We go back a little bit more than 15 years, and we go to 1968, and we read in the Sunday Telegraph in London. It published an article entitled "Strange Case of Climate Shift," and it detailed dire forecasts of increasing cold. And it quoted a very stern climate expert named Professor Gordon Manley of Lancaster University. He said, it looks as if 1950 was a peak year in warmth. And the article quoted an American counterpart of this Professor Manley, Dr. James Lodge of the National Center for Atmospheric Research over in Boulder, Colorado. And he said there are signs that glaciers may be advancing again, and suggested that another ice age is on the way. And then 10 years later, we're up to 1977, which of course is only 15 years from the day we're making this program here, 15 years back. The National Academy of Sciences, our national organization here in the United States, stated this. This prestigious body called for, quote, it said, evidence as diverse as the duration of the Arctic snow cover, animal migration, sea surface temperatures, and microfossils on the ocean floor are demonstrating to us that a new ice age is about to begin. Now, if you paid any attention to these authorities, you may have bought plenty of heavy coats and underwear. You may have stocked up on various types of fuel. You perhaps added energy-related investments to your portfolio. You may even packed up and moved to Arizona or to Florida or to Southern California or someplace. But 15 years ago, that's what those people were saying. And today, they're the very same people. In fact, one of the more prominent of them is a man named Stephen Schneider over at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado. And Stephen Schneider, who wrote a book in 1977 predicting the Ice Age, is now one of the leading proponents of the global warming hypothesis. It is, however, just a hypothesis, a theory. So how do you combat this if you don't believe it? Well, wouldn't it be nice if somebody had been taking temperature recordings of the Earth all around the Earth for many years, and you could go to the data and you could say, here's the data, it shows. In fact, wouldn't it be just simply wonderful if as many as 60,000 temperature readings were taken every single day at hundreds of stations, thousands of stations, that many, in fact, 60,000 stations all around the globe, and that they'd been doing this for about 100 years. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if we could go to that data and you could determine whether or not the Earth really was warming or really was cooling? And the reason I bring that up, ladies and gentlemen, is that that has happened. There are those readings available for over 100 years or close to 100 years. 60,000 readings taken daily all around the globe. The data is available, and anybody who goes to the data can demonstrate very quickly that the Earth is not warming and it is not cooling. Yes, indeed, there are some summers that are warmer than others and some winters that are cooler than others, but when you average it out over as little as a decade, you see that there is no warming and there is no cooling. And not only that, but 12 years ago, satellites were put up into space, and the satellites began to take temperature readings around the globe as well. And the satellites were reading temperatures not only over land, which is where the previous readings had been taken. These were able to read over water, over mountainous terrain, over the plains, over all kinds of terrain, and therefore their data is far more valuable. And I have a clipping here to show you from the San Francisco Chronicle of March 1990, reporting on the satellite studies. As you can see the headline, it says, "Satellite Study Finds No Signs of a Global Warming Trend." That was 1990. There are 2 more years of data, and the 2 more years confirm even more emphatically that there is no warming and there is no cooling. Now, I always like to say that your credentials aren't as important as your facts, as I started it off here, but also there are people who do have credentials who are putting out the same kind of disputing of this global warming hypothesis that I am myself. And our magazine, the John Birch Society's affiliated publication, the New American, put out an issue in June of 1992 discussing all of the possible subjects in the environmental logbook. And in this we had an article about the global warming business, but we also published a statement from atmospheric scientists who had been gathered together by a professor named S. Fred Singer, who taught for many years at the University of Virginia and is a professional atmospheric physicist. He gathered meteorologists and other atmospheric physicists, and he asked them to sign a statement which we then published, and the statement in part reads that the policy initiatives being suggested to combat the global warming theories derive from highly uncertain scientific theories. They are based on the unsupported assumption that catastrophic global warming follows from the burning of fossil fuels and requires immediate action. We do not agree, say these scientists. They went on to talk about the fact that they were disturbed, and I'm quoting here, that activists anxious to stop energy and economic growth are pushing ahead with drastic policies without taking notice of recent changes in the underlying science. We fear that the rush to impose global regulations will have catastrophic impacts on world economy, on jobs, standards of living, health care, with the most severe consequences falling upon developing countries and the poor. And there were 60-odd scientists who were willing to put their names to this, and these are the most prominent men in the United States in the field of meteorology and atmospheric science. Men like Dr. Hugh Alsacer of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in California, Dr. Richard Lindzen of the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, Elliot Abrams, the director of AccuWeather that gives the weather forecasts on radio stations in much of the country, Dr. Pat Michaels of the University of Virginia. And these men have begun to speak out about the unfounded claims of those who say that the earth is warming. And I want you to remember that they talked about the consequences of following the dictates of these individuals. They talked about stopping energy and economic growth. And it's very much a problem. Now, I had the good fortune of visiting with Dr. S. Fred Singer recently at his office in Arlington, Virginia. And I first of all thanked Dr. Singer for putting together that statement and gathering those names and then giving us permission to publish it in our magazine. And I asked him if there were other scientists that he could get to sign that very same statement, and he said, yes, many more. I said, well, how many more? 100 more? He said, no, 300 more, maybe 500 more. He said, if I had the time to do so, to contact them all and ask them to sign this, I'm certain that most of them would, because most of them have become quite aware that many of the claims of these environmentalists are not backed up by any facts at all. And he made the point to me, and it's a point that others have made, and that is that most of the environmentalists, so-called, are not scientists. They are environmentalists. They are bureaucrats. They are politicians. They are people who have an agenda, and they are using scientific fiction in order to promote their agenda. Now, I mentioned this Stephen Schneider, and he's a scientist over at the National Center in Boulder, Colorado. And just to give you an idea of how sinister this can become, we have an article here that was published in Science magazine in 1989, and there's a little portion of it headlined here. So let me read a portion of what Stephen Schneider said. Remember now, this is the man who predicted an ice age in 1977 and is now one of the leading proponents of the global warming hypothesis. He said, so we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we might have about these scientific hypotheses.